My name is Holly, and I am 34 years old. 2 months ago, at 1 in the morning, I was lying on my bathroom floor in Pennsylvania. The pain behind my navel had turned into a blinding heat. My appendix had ruptured. My husband Marcus was deployed overseas with the National Guard, so I dialed the one person he made me promise to call if an emergency happened, his mother Susan. When she finally answered on the fourth ring, I did not hear a concerned parent. I heard the deafening roar of a stadium crowd. I told her I could not stand up. I told her my 8-year-old daughter Maya was asleep down the hall, and I needed someone to sit with her so I could get to the emergency room. Susan shouted over the music. She told me she and my sister-in-law Lauren were in Philadelphia. They had VIP tickets to the Taylor Swift Eras Tour. She told me I always panic over every little bug and suggested I just take an Uber because they spent thousands on their seats. Then the line went dead. I dragged myself to my laptop. Sweating and trembling, I paid an exorbitant retainer to a bonded agency to dispatch an emergency night nurse. I drove myself to the hospital, gripping the steering wheel while my vision blurred. I woke up the next afternoon hooked to an IV. I checked my phone and saw a text from Susan, hoping my tummy ache passed and bragging about the stadium acoustics. Fueled by the betrayal, I hired a cheap legal service from my hospital bed to send a formal cease and desist letter to my in-laws, barring them from my home. I thought I was establishing a firm boundary. I did not realize I had just handed Susan the exact weapon she would use to try and take my child. 3 weeks later, I heard a sharp knock on my front door. Before I tell you who is standing on my porch, please subscribe to Eva Tells Stories. Only do it if you have ever realized the people supposed to protect you are the ones you need protection from. Drop your age and where you are listening from in the comments. Now let me take you back to the beginning to explain the powder keg we were sitting on long before Marcus deployed. To understand how I found myself lying in a hospital bed staring at a text message about stadium acoustics while my marriage hung by a thread, you have to understand the stage I spent years building for them. You have to look at the powder keg we were all sitting on long before Marcus packed his duffel bags and boarded a transport plane. I am a procurement manager for a regional hospital network. My daily life involves negotiating high-stakes contracts, anticipating supply chain shortages, and keeping chaotic systems running smoothly without anyone noticing the sweat it takes to hold it all together. I am paid to be accommodating to find solutions when vendors fall short and to smile through unreasonable demands. I brought that exact same survival tactic into my marriage. When Marcus and I got engaged, I treated his family like my most difficult high-maintenance clients. I decided I would simply outwork their reservations about me. Susan never hid her disappointment. She had envisioned her son marrying someone loud, spontaneous, someone who summered in coastal towns and possessed a sort of breezy confidence that only comes from generational wealth. Instead, Marcus brought home me. A woman who tracked household expenses on spreadsheets, arrived 15 minutes early to every event, and double-checked lock mechanisms. She saw my practical nature as a personal insult to her own lifestyle. She viewed me as rigidly anxious, a wet blanket thrown over their vibrant family dynamic. To truly understand Susan, you have to look at her daughter. Lauren is 30 years old and floats from one expensive hobby to the next, rebranding her life every few months. 2 years ago, she was a holistic wellness coach selling imported crystals. Last year, she designed artisanal candles that cost $80 each. Currently, she is an influencer focused on sustainable luxury travel. It is a rather ironic title considering David and Susan pay her rent, fund her flights, and cover her credit card minimums. Lauren possesses the effortless charm her mother worships, an ability to light up a room while leaving the bill for someone else to pay. I spent years trying to buy my way into their inner circle. I thought if I financed their illusions and catered their social events, they would eventually invite me to sit at the table rather than just serve the food. 3 years ago, I hosted Susan's annual Thanksgiving dinner. I spent 4 days prepping our home. I bought the imported floral centerpieces Susan insisted were necessary. I cooked for 25 of her friends while Marcus was away on a weekend training drill. I managed the entire house alone. When Susan arrived, she did not offer a word of thanks. She walked into my kitchen, ran a manicured finger over the edge of the marble island, and told her friends that I was trying so hard to keep up with their traditions. Later that same night, Lauren cornered me near the patio with a business proposition. She needed a custom e-commerce website for her candle business, and the designer she wanted quoted her $5,000. She looked at me swirling her wine glass and asked if I could cover the invoice as an early Christmas gift. A secure woman would have laughed and said no. A woman who recognized her own worth would have drawn a line. I took out my checkbook. I wrote the check because I believed transactional usefulness could slowly morph into genuine affection. I thought my utility would eventually earn their respect. I willingly financed my own exploitation because I was desperate to belong. You might picture Susan as a villain plotting my downfall in a dark room, but that is giving her far too much credit. Her neglect was not born of cartoonish evil. It was born of a profound, unyielding entitlement. She married David young. She raised Marcus and Lauren while David worked long hours at his firm. Now in her early 60s, she firmly believed she had served her sentence. She viewed her current decade as a delayed adolescence, a time to reclaim the fun she felt she had sacrificed for motherhood. She prioritized expensive dinners, weekend trips, and maintaining an image of eternal youth. When my daughter Maya was born, I assumed the dynamic would naturally shift. I thought becoming a grandmother would ground Susan, forcing her to look outside her own desires. I was wrong. Maya was treated as a charming accessory for holiday photos, a prop Susan could show off on social media for 5 minutes before handing her back to me. When Maya had a fever, or when I needed a last-minute babysitter because of a late meeting at the hospital, Susan was always unavailable. She had a Pilates class, or a wine tasting, or a sudden migraine. Real grandmother duties required sacrifice, and Susan felt she had already done her share of sacrificing in the 90s. Maya and my emergencies were simply an inconvenience to her joy. I ignored these glaring warnings. I packed the red flags away in a mental box because confronting them meant confronting my own terrifying isolation. My own parents passed away in a car accident when I was in my early 20s. Marcus was all I had. By extension, his family was the only extended family my daughter would ever know. The thought of admitting that my in-laws viewed us as burdensome strangers was too painful to process. So I kept writing checks. I kept hosting their lavish dinners. I kept pretending the coldness was just a quirky family dynamic that I had to navigate. The delicate balance of our household relied entirely on Marcus. He is a logistics officer, gifted at smoothing over rough edges and managing competing personalities. When Susan made a passive-aggressive comment about my clothing, Marcus would diffuse it with a quick joke. When Lauren asked for another loan, Marcus would handle the refusal behind closed doors, so I did not have to be the bad guy. He was the buffer zone between my rigid anxiety and their chaotic entitlement. As long as he was sleeping in our bed every night, the arrangement held together. We existed in a highly functional stalemate. But the military does not care about your fragile domestic truces. Everything changed one damp evening in October. Marcus came home from the base, his face drawn tight. He hung his keys on the hook, looked at me across the kitchen counter, and delivered the news. His unit had been activated. He was deploying overseas for 9 months. The safety net was being ripped away. I was about to become a single mother working 50 hours a week, managing a house, a child, and a high-stress job with zero margin for error. I knew I was going to need help. I knew I would have to rely on the very people who saw me as an open wallet and an annoying obstacle. We sat down in Susan and David's living room the week before Marcus flew out, hoping to secure a lifeline for me and Maya. I had no idea I was walking straight into a trap that would nearly cost me my child. 3 days before Marcus flew out of the country, we sat in his parents' immaculate living room. The space looked like a staged showroom. White linen sofas, fragile glass coffee tables, not a single framed photo of a messy family vacation in sight. Marcus sat next to me on the pristine couch. He leaned forward, his hands clasped, and looked at his mother and father. He explained the harsh reality of a 9-month overseas deployment. He told them he would be in a different time zone, unreachable for days at a stretch. He looked at David first. My father-in-law is a man who treats silence as a survival strategy. David spent his entire adult life retreating from difficult conversations, allowing Susan to steer the family ship while he stayed safely below deck. He nodded slowly when Marcus spoke, offering a tight, non-committal smile. David never makes waves. He pays the bills, reads historical biographies, and excuses himself to the garage whenever Lauren throws a tantrum or Susan decides to critique someone's lifestyle choices. When Marcus asked him directly to keep an eye on us, David cleared his throat, offered a firm handshake, and mumbled a guarantee that he would handle anything we needed. It was a hollow pledge from a man who considered stepping in front of his wife an act of treason. Then Marcus turned to Susan. He laid it out clearly. He asked her to be my designated emergency contact. He explained that my job at the hospital procurement desk was demanding that Maya had soccer practice and piano lessons, and that I was about to shoulder the burden of a two-parent household alone. I watched Susan lean across the glass table. She placed her manicured hand over my knee. She smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners with what looked like genuine warmth. She told Marcus to focus on his mission. She promised she was only a phone call away. She assured him that family takes care of family. I sat there and nodded. I smiled back. I allowed myself to inhale that toxic hope. I wanted to believe her. I needed the illusion of a safety net, but the unspoken reality of the military spouse community is a harsh one. When the uniform leaves the driveway, the civilian support structure often evaporates. People promise to mow your lawn, invite you to dinner, or watch your kids. They mean it in the moment. Then weeks pass. Their own lives take precedence. The phone stops ringing. You become a living reminder of an uncomfortable truth, a struggling solo parent they would rather ignore than assist. I knew the statistics. I knew the isolation was coming. I just did not realize the specific devastating form it would take. Marcus shipped out on a Tuesday. By Wednesday morning, the silence in our house felt heavy enough to crush bone. The first 2 months were a grueling marathon of endurance. I woke up at 5 in the morning to pack lunches, coordinate school drop-offs, and commute to the hospital network headquarters. I navigated supply chain delays, negotiated vendor disputes, and managed multi-million-dollar contracts. Then I rushed home, cooked dinner, checked homework, and put my daughter to bed. I lived on coffee and adrenaline. Twice a week, I managed a patchy video call with my husband. He looked exhausted, the strain of his command evident in the tight lines around his eyes. He would ask how we were holding up. I would plaster a bright smile onto my face, adjust the camera angle to hide the laundry piled on the dining chair, and lie. I told him Maya was thriving. I told him work was fine. I told him his parents were checking in. I refused to add my domestic stress to his combat zone burdens. I was the buffer now. I swallowed my panic and projected total control. Meanwhile, the phone call away that Susan had promised turned into dead air. Weeks blurred together without a single text message asking how Maya was doing in school, or if I needed an hour to myself. I did not push the issue. I did not want to seem needy. I handled the isolation the same way I handled vendor shortages at work. I put my head down and forced a solution. Susan visited our house exactly once during those first 2 months. It was a late Friday afternoon in early September. She arrived unannounced, complaining about the traffic and the humidity. She walked into my kitchen, bypassed the glass of water I offered, and poured herself a generous pour of my expensive red wine. She did not ask to see her granddaughter who was drawing in the next room. Instead, she leaned against my counter and launched into a monologue about her own struggles. Susan complained about the soaring interest rates on her credit cards. She sighed dramatically over the cost of imported tile for her bathroom renovation. She framed her financial complaints not as a symptom of overspending, but as a personal injustice inflicted upon her by a cruel economy. I stood there exhausted from a 50-hour work week, listening to a woman lament the price of Italian marble, while I worried about keeping my household from fracturing. Then she shifted the topic to Lauren. Lauren had recently endured a breakup with a local real estate developer. According to Susan, her 30-year-old daughter was inconsolable, suffering from severe emotional distress that required immediate, lavish intervention. Susan took a sip of my wine and casually mentioned that she had secured a remedy. She had purchased VIP tickets to the Taylor Swift Eras Tour in Philadelphia. She called it a much-needed mental health break for Lauren. She described the exclusive seating, the exorbitant cost of the hotel they booked nearby, and the custom outfits they were putting together. I nodded politely. I congratulated her on scoring such rare tickets. I suppressed the bitter sting of resentment. She had the time, energy, and resources to plan an extravagant weekend getaway for her adult daughter, yet she could not spare 30 minutes to watch her 8-year-old granddaughter so I could take a nap. I did not say a word. I smiled, poured her another glass of wine, and maintained the peace. What I did not know that Friday afternoon was the dark reality beneath her casual bragging. I did not know that David was silently sweating through sleepless nights because those concert tickets were not bought with disposable income. They were bought on high-interest credit, stacking onto a mountain of toxic debt that was slowly suffocating their household. I did not know that Susan's desperate need to maintain her lifestyle was pushing them toward a financial cliff. Most importantly, I did not know that those specific VIP tickets would become the catalyst for the most terrifying night of my life. The date of that concert was rapidly approaching. It was scheduled for the exact same weekend my body decided to fail, leaving me entirely alone in the dark, dialing a phone that would ring and ring while the music drowned out my cries for help. The timeline shifted from a quiet Friday evening into a nightmare with terrifying speed. It started just after dinner. I was washing dishes at the kitchen sink when a dull, persistent ache settled right behind my navel. At first I dismissed it. My job trains me to filter out distractions, and military spouses learn quickly to ignore their own discomfort. I assumed it was mild food poisoning or the physical manifestation of my ongoing stress. I took a basic painkiller, poured a large glass of water, and sat down at the dining table to help Maya with her math homework. By 9 o'clock, the ache had not faded, but I managed to tuck my daughter into bed, read her a story, and kiss her forehead. I retreated to the living room couch, expecting the heavy discomfort to pass with a few hours of rest. It did not pass. It sharpened into something entirely different. By 11 o'clock, the dull throb had migrated to the lower right side of my abdomen, turning into a hot, piercing spear. I tried to lie down, curling into a tight fetal position to relieve the mounting pressure against my organs. Every time I inhaled deeply, the room seemed to tilt and spin. An hour later, my temperature spiked. I was sweating through my cotton pajamas, my teeth chattering from a sudden fierce chill. I crawled from the living room rug to the hallway, dragging myself toward the bathroom. I gripped the wooden doorframe to keep from collapsing, but my legs gave out. I lay on the cold ceramic tiles, my cheek pressed against the floor, vomiting until my throat was raw and my chest burned. The cold logic of modern American healthcare and solo parenting began to war with my failing body. If I called an emergency dispatch, the ambulance ride alone would cost thousands of dollars out of pocket. Worse, the paramedics would arrive to find an incapacitated mother and an 8-year-old child with no legal guardian present. Protocol would dictate that they call the police or state protective services to take temporary custody of Maya while I was transported to the surgical ward. The thought of my young daughter waking up to flashing red lights, loud radios, and uniformed strangers hauling her mother away on a stretcher was more agonizing than the rupture happening inside my gut. I needed a buffer. I needed a designated adult to sit on my living room couch, hold Maya's hand, and tell her everything would be fine while I drove myself to the emergency room. I needed the safety net Marcus had painstakingly secured. At 1 a.m, trembling and gasping for air, I reached up and pulled my mobile phone off the bathroom counter. I dialed Susan. The phone rang 3 times and went straight to her automated voicemail. I hung up, steadied my shaking thumb, and dialed again. Voicemail. I dropped the device on the tiles, the loud clatter echoing in the small room. I retrieved it and dialed David. I knew my father-in-law silenced his phone after 10 o'clock to avoid Lauren calling him with her late-night emotional crises, but I desperately hoped the repeated calls might bypass his do not disturb settings. The line rang 5 times. It clicked over to his sterile monotone greeting. I lay on my back, staring at the bright bathroom ceiling fixture, trying to calculate my remaining options. I barely knew the surrounding neighbors. The family to our left had moved in a month ago, and the elderly couple to our right were in Florida for the winter. I could not stumble across the street in the dead of night, banging on a stranger's door while leaving Maya unattended in an unlocked house. My vision swam with dark spots. I had exactly one lifeline left. I opened my contacts and tapped Lauren's name. The call connected on the fourth ring. The immediate sound tearing through the speaker was not a standard greeting. It was the deafening rhythmic thud of heavy stadium bass and the overlapping frantic screams of thousands of people. Lauren shouted into the receiver, her voice dripping with profound irritation. She demanded to know why I was calling her during the opening act. I pressed the phone hard against my ear, trying to force my voice past the pain radiating through my torso. I told her I was lying on the bathroom floor. I told her I could not stand up or walk. I begged her to tap Susan on the shoulder and tell her I needed someone to drive over and stay with Maya so I could go to the hospital. Lauren scoffed. The sound of her disbelief was clear even over the roaring stadium noise. She told me I was ruining their night. She said they were in Philadelphia, settling into the exclusive seating section, and the main concert event was about to start. Her tone lacked any trace of panic or concern. To Lauren, my medical crisis was just another annoying symptom of my rigid, high-strung personality. She told me to take some Advil drink, some ginger ale, and sleep it off. She insisted I always overreact to every little physical bug. A fresh wave of agony hit my lower abdomen, forcing a ragged sob from my throat. I did not care about my pride anymore. I begged her. I pleaded with her to pass the device to her mother. I heard the rustle of the phone changing hands, followed by a muffled complaint from Lauren. Then Susan's voice came through the speaker. She did not ask about my symptoms. She did not ask if Maya was awake or frightened. Her voice was an icy, impenetrable wall of management. She spoke to me the same way I speak to a careless vendor who misses a crucial delivery deadline. Susan informed me that driving back to my house would take over 2 hours in the current event traffic. She reminded me that they had spent thousands of dollars on these specific luxury seats. She noted that their upscale hotel reservation was entirely non-refundable. She firmly stated that they were not going to abandon a once-in-a-lifetime musical experience just because I had a common stomachache. I tried to explain the severity of the pain. I told her my vision was blurring and I thought my appendix was failing. I whispered into the receiver that I was terrified. Susan sighed. It was a heavy theatrical sound designed to convey her immense burden and my deep inconvenience. She advised me to stop being dramatic. She suggested I walk outside and wake up a neighbor if I truly believed I required a doctor. She told me to act like a capable adult instead of a helpless dependent. Then she delivered her final instruction. She told me to stop calling and let them enjoy their hard-earned weekend. The line went dead. I pulled the phone away from my ear and stared at the dark glass screen. The silence in my bathroom was profound, broken only by my own shallow, uneven breathing. The rejection I had just experienced was not born of panic or confusion. It was deeply, terrifyingly logical. Susan had weighed the value of my physical safety against the value of her daughter's entertainment, and the concert had won the calculation. Her 60-year-old right to reclaim her youth trumped the solemn promise she made to her deployed son. My crisis was an unapproved interruption to her glamorous schedule. I was entirely alone. Marcus was asleep in a secure bunk on the other side of the planet. My in-laws were drinking overpriced cocktails in a crowded stadium. My daughter was dreaming 30 feet away, trusting that her world was safe because her mother was standing guard. I realized in that sterile, agonizing moment that no family member was coming to save me. If I lost consciousness on these tiles, Maya would wake up in a few hours to find me unresponsive. I had to bypass my pride, my carefully managed budget, and my fear. I gripped the edge of the wooden vanity, pulled my sweating body upward, and prepared to make a desperate choice that would drain my savings and ignite a quiet, brutal war. Panic is a terrible strategist. Lying on the bath mat with the dial tone echoing in my ears, my brain tried to formulate a backup plan. The most obvious solution was 30 feet away across a dark lawn. I could wrap a coat over my pajamas, stagger outside, and pound on the siding of the house next door. But modern suburban America is not a community of open doors at 2 a.m. I barely knew the young couple who had just moved in. If a frantic, sweating woman showed up on their porch in the middle of the night, demanding they take in her child, they would not offer tea and sympathy. They would call the authorities. Furthermore, I was deeply terrified of fulfilling the stereotype of the hysterical, coping-deprived military wife. If the police or a social worker arrived to find me incapacitated, my daughter would be handed over to the state foster system until a relative could be located. Since my designated relatives were currently sipping overpriced drinks at a stadium, Maya would spend the night in a sterile government office. That was a risk I refused to take. I forced my body off the bathroom floor. I used the edge of the sink to pull myself upright, biting my lips so hard I tasted copper. I dragged my feet down the hallway, keeping one hand pressed against the drywall for balance until I reached my home office. I collapsed into the desk chair and flipped open my laptop. The screen glare felt like a physical strike against my eyes. I typed search queries with trembling fingers, looking for specialized emergency care. I bypassed standard babysitting sites. No teenager or college student would answer a request at this hour. I searched for bonded medical caregiving agencies, the kind of premium services utilized for sudden hospitalizations or high-end elder care. I found a firm based out of the city that advertised 24-hour emergency dispatch. I dialed their toll-free number. A calm clinical dispatcher answered. I explained my situation, keeping my sentences short to conserve air. I needed a background-checked, registered pediatric nurse at my address immediately. The dispatcher informed me they had a professional available, but the emergency out-of-hours dispatch required a severe premium. The cost was a $3,000 upfront retainer billed instantly with an hourly rate applied thereafter. $3,000 was a staggering sum. It was money Marcus and I had carefully earmarked for a new HVAC system. But standing on the precipice of a ruptured organ, money loses its abstract value and becomes a simple tool for survival. I pulled my wallet from my purse. I extracted the emergency credit card, the specific plastic rectangle Marcus and I promised to use only for catastrophic events, and read the numbers to the dispatcher. The transaction was approved. A nurse would arrive in 40 minutes. Those 40 minutes stretched into a quiet eternity. I packed a small overnight bag for myself, tossing in underwear, a phone charger, and toiletries with clumsy hands. Then I walked into Maya's bedroom. The room was bathed in the soft glow of a star-shaped nightlight. My daughter was tangled in her blankets, breathing softly. Waking her was the hardest task of the night. I knelt beside her bed, smoothed her hair, and spoke in the most level, reassuring voice I could manage. I told Maya that Mommy had a bad stomach ache and needed to visit the doctors at the hospital to get some medicine. I explained that a very nice professional nurse was coming to sit in the living room and watch television until morning. Maya rubbed her eyes, confused and groggy, but the absence of panic in my voice kept her calm. Children mirror their parents. Because I was projecting the organized efficiency of a procurement manager, Maya simply nodded, hugged her stuffed bear, and asked if I would be home for breakfast. I promised her I would see her soon, praying I was telling the truth. The doorbell rang exactly 40 minutes after my transaction. I opened the door to find a woman in her late 40s wearing crisp navy blue scrubs and an identification badge on a lanyard. She introduced herself as Claire. She carried a tablet, a medical bag, and an aura of supreme competence. I handed her a printed sheet containing Maya's medical information, Marcus's overseas deployment details, and the local precinct number. Claire took one look at my pale, sweating face and offered to call an ambulance. I shook my head, handed her the spare house key, and walked out into the freezing night air. The drive to the regional medical center took 12 minutes. It felt like 12 hours. I gripped the leather steering wheel with both hands, my knuckles turning white. The empty Pennsylvania roads blurred together. Every pothole and uneven seam in the asphalt sent a shockwave of white-hot agony through my lower torso. I focused on the dashed yellow lines, counting my breaths, bargaining with my own failing biology to hold on just a little longer. I pulled into the emergency room parking lot, parked haphazardly across two spaces, and stumbled through the sliding glass doors. The triage waiting room was brightly lit and mostly empty. A security guard looked up from his desk, his expression shifting from boredom to immediate concern. I reached the reception counter, slapped my driver's license and insurance card onto the plastic surface, and tried to speak. Before the words could form, the pressure inside my abdomen reached its breaking point. A sensation like a balloon bursting echoed through my core, followed instantly by a wave of blinding, suffocating pain that drove me straight to my knees. My appendix had ruptured right there on the waiting room tile. The sterile environment erupted into motion. Nurses sprinted from behind the desk. A gurney appeared. Hands lifted me onto the mattress. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered past as they wheeled me down a long corridor. A doctor shouted orders regarding sepsis protocols and immediate surgical intervention. A mask was placed over my face, and the sharp scent of anesthesia filled my lungs. The world finally went dark. I woke up the next afternoon. My mouth tasted like dry cotton and iodine. I blinked against the harsh afternoon sunlight streaming through the hospital window. I was lying in a private recovery room, a rhythmic beeping sounding from a monitor near my head. An intravenous line snaked into the back of my hand, pumping antibiotics and heavy painkillers into my bloodstream. My abdomen felt tight, wrapped in thick bandages, aching with a dull, manageable soreness that was vastly different from the preceding agony. A nurse entered the room, checked my vitals, and informed me that the surgery had been complicated. The rupture had spilled infection into my abdominal cavity, requiring extensive cleaning and a mandatory 4-day inpatient recovery. I thanked her, my voice raspy. She pointed to a clear plastic belongings bag resting on the bedside table. I reached inside and retrieved my mobile phone. I pressed the power button. The screen illuminated, displaying a cluster of notifications. I processed them methodically. The first was an email from the caregiving agency confirming that Claire had completed her shift, securely handed Maya over to a trusted school counselor I had authorized from my hospital bed hours prior, and logged out. Maya was safe. The second notification was a text message from Marcus. He had found a pocket of internet connectivity overseas. The message was short, sweet, and entirely oblivious to the chaos unfolding at home. He told me he loved me, he missed us, and he hoped we were having a good weekend. The third notification was a text message from Susan. I opened the thread. The timestamp showed it was sent at 10 in the morning, long after their concert had ended, long after they had slept in their luxury hotel beds. I stared at the glowing text. Hope your tummy ache passed. The acoustics in the VIP section were to die for. The message concluded with a sparkling star emoji. I read the words 3 times. There was no follow-up text asking if I felt better. There was no missed call checking to see if Maya was fed. Susan had dismissed my emergency, enjoyed her expensive spectacle, and sent a glib, mocking summary of her night without a single thought for my safety. Lying in that hospital bed pumped full of surgical painkillers, staring at that glittering digital star, a fundamental shift occurred inside my chest. The desperate, accommodating procurement manager who funded websites and hosted lavish dinners evaporated. The woman who swallowed insults to keep the peace ceased to exist. That sparkling emoji severed the final tether holding my patients together. I was done negotiating with people who viewed my survival as an inconvenience. I was not just angry, I was liberated by a cold, calculating fury. I placed the phone flat on the rolling tray table. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and prepared to execute a retaliatory strike that would escalate our domestic Cold War into a formal legal battle. I reached for my laptop, ready to make a decision that would backfire in ways I could not yet fathom. In the sterile quiet of my recovery room, the rhythmic hiss of the vital sign monitor became the soundtrack to my breaking point. I lay flat on my back, the narcotic painkillers dulling the physical throb of my stapled abdomen, but doing nothing to soothe the sharp, blinding clarity expanding in my mind. I stared at the digital text message from Susan. The sparkling star emoji sat at the end of her sentence, a bright, mocking punctuation mark to the most terrifying night of my life. My mother-in-law had prioritized stadium acoustics over my survival, and she possessed such a profound lack of self-awareness that she felt comfortable bragging about it the morning after. Years of pent-up resentment boiled over, flooding my system with a reckless, frantic energy. I did not pause to consider strategy. I did not consult a clear-headed friend. I operated purely on the fumes of exhaustion, surgical trauma, and a fierce desire for retaliation. I wanted to hurt them the way they had hurt me. I wanted to build a fortress around my daughter and myself, a wall so high and legally intimidating that Susan and Lauren would never be able to peer over it again. I reached across the rolling hospital tray and dragged my laptop onto my lap. The screen cast a pale blue glow over the dark room. My fingers felt thick and clumsy from the anesthesia, but my intent was razor sharp. I opened a search engine and bypassed local family law practices, knowing they would require intake meetings, consultation fees, and rational discussions. I did not want a rational discussion. I wanted a weapon, and I wanted it dispatched immediately. I found a discount online legal service, the kind of automated portal where you pay a flat fee, fill out a digital questionnaire, and a remote attorney stamps their signature on a boilerplate document. I typed in my credit card information. I filled out the forms with clinical precision. I requested a formal cease and desist letter directed at Susan, David, and Lauren. I articulated the terms with brutal clarity. They were officially barred from my residential property. They were prohibited from contacting Maya at her elementary school. Any attempt to reach my mobile phone, my personal email, or my workplace would be documented and treated as targeted harassment. I read the preview document on the screen. The legal jargon looked severe and uncompromising. It carried the exact tone of cold authority I craved. I signed the form, digitally hit the submit button, and paid an extra fee to have the letter expedited via certified overnight mail. The confirmation screen flashed, and I closed the laptop. I sank back into the stiff hospital pillows, feeling a rush of vindication. I thought I was taking back my power. I thought I was proving to my in-laws and to myself that I did not need their conditional transactional affection to survive. I was wrong. It was an incredibly stupid, impulsive move. When you act out of raw emotion, you abandon logic. I am a procurement manager. I spend my professional life understanding the binding nature of contracts and the limitations of legal threats. I should have known better. A cease and desist letter drafted by a discount online mill has no real legal teeth. Without underlying criminal charges, a filed police report, or a judge-mandated restraining order, the document is essentially a piece of intimidating stationery. It is a paper shield. Worse than being ineffective, it is dangerous in the wrong context. Sending a formal legal threat to your deployed husband's parents without any prior mediation does not make you look strong. To an outside observer, it makes you look unhinged. It paints a picture of a volatile, erratic individual escalating a familial disagreement into a courtroom drama. I thought I was establishing an ironclad boundary. I did not realize I had just handed Susan the exact narrative she needed to destroy my reputation. I spent 4 days in the hospital recovering from the infection that had spilled into my abdominal cavity. The antibiotics left me drained and nauseous. I managed Maya's schedule from my bed, coordinating with the school counselor and neighbors to ensure she got to class and had a safe place to sleep. Every logistical hurdle required immense effort, reminding me constantly of the vulnerability of my situation. I focused entirely on getting discharged, ignoring the ticking clock of the certified mail traveling toward my in-laws' upscale neighborhood. When the doctors finally cleared me to leave, I ordered a rideshare and returned to my house. Walking through the front door took every ounce of strength I possessed. The living room was exactly as I had left it on the night of the rupture. A half-empty glass of water sat on the coffee table. My shoes were kicked off near the sofa. I walked slowly down the hallway, checked on my sleeping daughter, and collapsed into my own bed. Over the next few days, a profound stillness settled over my home. My mobile phone did not ring. There were no incoming text messages from Susan demanding an explanation. There were no voicemails from David trying to smooth things over. The certified mail tracking receipt showed the letter had been delivered and signed, for yet the silence from their end was deafening. In my medication-hazy state, I interpreted that quiet as a victory. I assumed the harsh legal language had shocked them into submission. I pictured Susan reading the document, feeling a sudden crushing wave of embarrassment for her actions. I imagined David finally realizing the severity of their neglect. I thought they had retreated into their immaculate house to lick their wounds, too ashamed to face the consequences of their selfishness. That assumption was the second major miscalculation of my week. I completely underestimated the ferocity of a narcissist whose public image has just been challenged. Women like Susan do not experience shame the way ordinary people do. They do not reflect on their behavior and recognize their own flaws. When a person whose entire identity is built on social superiority and maternal martyrdom receives a legal threat from a daughter-in-law she already views as inferior, she does not feel remorse. She feels insulted. She views the boundary as an unprovoked attack on her character. Susan did not retreat. She viewed the cease and desist not as a warning to stay away, but as a formal declaration of war. By utilizing a lawyer to handle a family dispute, I had given her permission to abandon all social pleasantries and fight dirty. I had inadvertently validated every negative opinion she ever held about me. In her mind, she was no longer the neglectful grandmother who went to a pop concert while her daughter-in-law faced emergency surgery. She was the victim of an unstable, hysterical woman trying to tear her family apart. While I was resting in my bed, sipping herbal tea and congratulating myself on my newfound independence, Susan was putting on her designer coat and driving downtown. She did not use a discount online legal portal. She walked into the polished office of a very expensive, very real family attorney. She carried my hastily drafted letter in her purse, ready to spin a narrative that would turn my desperate attempt at protection into a weapon aimed directly at my marriage. I had no idea the backlash was already crossing the ocean, preparing to hit my deployed husband with devastating force. The silence in my house broke 5 days after my discharge. I was sitting at the kitchen table, gingerly pressing an ice pack against my healing incision when my mobile phone vibrated against the wood. The caller ID displayed an international routing number. It was Marcus. I swiped to answer, a genuine smile forming on my face for the first time in a week. I was eager to hear his voice, ready to lean into the comfort of my husband. The smile vanished the moment he spoke. The satellite connection was terrible, filled with static and a strange metallic echo, but the panic radiating through the digital delay was unmistakable. He did not ask how my recovery was progressing. He did not ask if Maya was safe. His voice was tight, breathless, carrying the distinct cadence of a man attempting to defuse a live explosive while blindfolded. He asked me what the hell was going on with the lawyers. My stomach dropped. The ice pack slipped from my grip, hitting the table with a soft thud. I realized instantly that Susan had not retreated. She had bypassed me, entirely launching her counteroffensive directly at the most vulnerable target available. Marcus explained his words, clipping over the static, that he had just returned from a grueling 24-hour shift to find his secure email inbox flooded. Susan had scanned the cease and desist letter and attached it to a lengthy, highly emotional message. She did not include the context of the Taylor Swift concert. She did not mention her refusal to drive home. Instead, she painted a terrifying, masterfully crafted picture of my mental state. She claimed I had suffered a severe psychological breakdown due to the stress of his deployment. She wrote that I was acting erratically, exhibiting paranoid behavior, and systematically alienating Maya from her loving grandparents. The most devastating blow, however, was how she weaponized the emergency nurse. Susan informed Marcus that in a fit of hysteria, I had abandoned his 8-year-old daughter in the middle of the night, handing her over to a total stranger hired off the internet. Marcus was caught in an impossible position. He was a logistics officer tasked with coordinating troop movements in a combat zone. His daily reality involved high-stakes operational security, sleep deprivation, and the constant thrumming tension of a hostile environment. He relied on the assumption that his home front was stable. Suddenly, he was managing a chaotic domestic war from a continent away, trying to decipher the truth between his mother's frantic accusations and the stark, aggressive legal document bearing my name. He did not immediately take her side. Marcus knows his mother's flair for the dramatic, and he knows my tendency toward anxious over-preparation. But the legal escalation had thoroughly rattled him. His voice carried a profound, exhausted frustration that broke my heart faster than any insult Susan could hurl. He asked me why I felt the need to involve an attorney. He asked why I could not just establish a boundary quietly or call David to mediate the situation. He pleaded with me, asking why I did not simply wait for his scheduled phone call so he could handle his family the way he always had. I gripped the edge of the kitchen table, my incision burning with a sudden sharp ache. I tried to explain the agonizing reality of that Friday night. I described the blinding pain, the fear of losing consciousness on the bathroom floor, the roaring stadium crowd in the background of Lauren's phone call. I tried to make him understand the sheer isolating terror of realizing his mother had chosen a pop concert over my survival. But distance and static are the enemies of nuance. Every time I tried to defend my actions, my voice rose. The surgical exhaustion combined with the shock of Susan's betrayal made my explanations sound frantic. I sounded defensive. I sounded angry. To a man listening through a delayed satellite connection thousands of miles away, I sounded exactly like the erratic, unstable woman Susan had described in her email. I realized in that moment the catastrophic error of my impulsive retaliation. If I had simply blocked their numbers, locked my doors, and waited to explain the situation to Marcus calmly, I would have retained the moral high ground. He would have seen his mother's neglect clearly. Instead, by deploying a discount legal threat, I shifted the focus away from her callous behavior and placed it squarely on my own extreme reaction. I gave them a shield, and I gave Marcus a reason to doubt my judgment. The conversation ended without resolution. Marcus had to report for a briefing. He told me he loved me, but the sign-off lacked its usual warmth. It was the mechanical sign-off of a man who was deeply worried about the stability of the woman raising his child. The line clicked dead, leaving me in a kitchen that suddenly felt vast and empty. The unique isolation of military spouse life crushed down on me. I could not vent to my civilian coworkers. They did not understand the pressure cooker of deployment. I could not complain to the other spouses in Marcus's unit. Any hint of domestic instability could reflect poorly on his command structure. I was entirely alone, trapped in a house that felt less like a sanctuary and more like a bunker. My marriage, the one solid foundation I had relied upon, felt strained and fragile. I spent the next 2 weeks navigating a grim, exhausting routine. I managed my procurement job remotely from my laptop, my physical energy depleted by the lingering infection. I tried to maintain a cheerful facade for Maya, helping her with science projects and packing her lunches, while concealing the fact that her grandparents were actively trying to paint me as an unfit mother. I slept in 2-hour increments, waking up drenched in sweat, staring at the ceiling, and replaying that disastrous phone call with Marcus. I thought the worst part of the ordeal was the emotional fallout. I thought managing my husband's disappointment and surviving the physical recovery were the final hurdles I had to clear. I assumed Susan had played her best card by writing that email to Marcus. I believed the conflict had settled into a tense, icy standoff. I was unprepared for the reality of Susan's vindictiveness. She was not satisfied with merely damaging my marriage. My legal letter had wounded her pride, and a narcissist does not rest until the source of their injury is entirely dismantled. While I was struggling to heal my incision and reassure my daughter, Susan was carefully assembling the pieces of a much darker, far more dangerous retaliatory strike. The true cost of my impulsive boundary was about to arrive on my doorstep. 3 weeks after I returned home from the hospital on a quiet Tuesday morning, when the neighborhood was still and the autumn air was crisp, the silence was shattered. I was standing in my kitchen wearing loose pajamas, trying to summon the energy to wash a stack of coffee mugs, when I heard it. It was a sharp, authoritative knock on the front door. It was not the hesitant tap of a neighbor or the quick rap of a delivery driver. It was a rhythmic, commanding sound that demanded immediate entry. I wiped my hands on a dish towel, pulled my robe tighter across my chest, and walked toward the entryway, unaware that the person standing on the other side of the wood was about to threaten the only thing in the world that mattered to me. The knock echoed through the quiet house a second time, louder and more insistent. I tightened the belt of my robe and shuffled toward the entryway. It was a Tuesday morning shortly after 9 o'clock. I had managed to get Maya onto the school bus an hour prior, a small victory that left me entirely depleted. My physical recovery was stalling. The surgical stitches pulled tight with every step, and the lingering effects of the antibiotics left me feeling hollowed out and perpetually dizzy. The house reflected my condition. The living room was a cluttered landscape of unfolded laundry baskets, scattered textbooks, and empty takeout containers I had not found the energy to discard. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy wooden door open, expecting to sign for a package or perhaps greet a utility worker checking a meter. The woman standing on my porch did not carry a cardboard box. She was dressed in practical, sensible slacks and a tailored blazer. She held a thick plastic clipboard pressed against her chest. A laminated identification card hung from a breakaway lanyard around her neck, bearing the unmistakable seal of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. She introduced herself as Mrs. Higgins. She spoke with a practiced, neutral cadence, the kind of voice designed to lower temperatures, while simultaneously conveying absolute authority. She informed me she was an investigator with the Department of Human Services Child Protective Division. My blood turned to ice water. The ambient noise of the suburban morning, the distant hum of a lawnmower, the chirp of a passing bird dropped away entirely. A roaring static filled my ears. I gripped the doorframe, my knuckles turning white as Mrs. Higgins explained the nature of her visit. She stated her office had received an urgent anonymous tip regarding the welfare of an 8-year-old minor residing at this address. The anonymity was a bureaucratic formality. We both knew exactly who had placed the call. Mrs. Higgins read from a printed summary attached to her clipboard. The allegations were precise, calculated, and devastatingly specific. The caller claimed that the mother of the child, a military spouse isolated by a recent overseas deployment, was suffering from a severe, undiagnosed psychological collapse. The report alleged that I was heavily abusing prescription narcotics. The most damning accusation, however, involved the night of my surgery. The caller stated I had engaged in erratic, dangerous behavior by hiring an unvetted, unlicensed stranger off the internet and abandoning my young daughter with them in the middle of the night to seek unnecessary medical attention. I stopped breathing. Susan had not just spun a narrative for Marcus. She had weaponized every piece of available data to orchestrate a formal state intervention. She took the indisputable fact that I had utilized an emergency nurse, combined it with the aggressive nature of the cease and desist letter, and filtered it through the lens of a concerned grandmother protecting her deployed son's child. She had crafted a portrait of a mother spiraling into a psychotic break. Mrs. Higgins lowered the clipboard and looked at me. Her gaze was not unkind, but it was highly observational. She was taking inventory. I saw myself through her trained eyes. I was standing in a bathrobe at 9 in the morning on a weekday. My face was pale, my hair was unwashed and pulled into a messy knot, and my posture was rigid and defensive. Behind me, clearly visible through the open doorway, was a living room that looked chaotic and disorganized. To a caseworker investigating a claim of parental depression and neglect, I looked exactly like the suspect described in the report. This was not a courtroom drama where a clever protagonist immediately produces a receipt and proves their innocence on the spot. State welfare agencies do not operate on benefit of the doubt. Once a formal allegation involving the safety of a minor is filed, a rigid bureaucratic protocol is engaged. The truth is irrelevant until it is documented, verified, and approved by a supervisor. I was officially under investigation. Mrs. Higgins informed me that she needed to conduct a preliminary assessment of the home environment. She asked for permission to step inside. The question was phrased politely, but the underlying threat was clear. If I refused entry, she would return with a police escort and a court order. I stepped aside, pulling my robe tighter, and allowed a stranger from the government to walk into my house. The next 2 hours were the most humiliating experience of my adult life. I trailed behind Mrs. Higgins as she conducted a systematic inspection of my private space. She checked the temperature of the running water in the bathroom. She opened the refrigerator in the kitchen, noting the fresh produce and the milk. She inspected the smoke detectors. She requested to see where Maya slept, examining the neatly made bed and the organized closet. She was professional, treating my home like a sterile checklist, but every box she ticked felt like a violation of my dignity. We sat down at the kitchen table, pushing aside a stack of Maya's art projects. Mrs. Higgins opened a fresh notebook. She requested immediate access to my medical records, specifically demanding the surgical notes from my recent hospitalization and the prescription logs for any painkillers I was currently taking. I had to sign a HIPAA release form waiving my medical privacy to prove I was not a drug addict. I had to produce the invoice and the background check credentials for the bonded nursing agency I had utilized on the night of the rupture. I had to defend the necessity of my emergency surgery to a woman holding a pen. Then came the hardest part. Mrs. Higgins informed me that standard protocol required her to interview the minor child privately. She needed to speak with Maya alone, without my presence or influence. My heart fractured. The thought of my sweet, anxious 8-year-old daughter sitting in a closed room with a government investigator answering questions about her mother's mental state was intolerable. Maya was already struggling with the absence of her father. Now she was going to be subjected to an interrogation designed to assess if she was safe in her own home. I tried to object. I tried to explain the vindictive nature of my mother-in-law. I tried to outline the history of Susan's entitlement, the Taylor Swift concert, and the retaliatory nature of the anonymous tip. Mrs. Higgins listened patiently, her expression neutral. She nodded, scribbled a note on her pad, and smoothly redirected the conversation. "Domestic disputes between in-laws are common," she stated calmly. "However, my mandate is exclusively the physical and emotional safety of the child. I must conduct the interview." I had to pick Maya up from school early. I drove to the elementary campus, my hands slick with sweat on the steering wheel. I signed her out of the front office, offering the receptionist a fake bright smile. In the car, I tried to prepare my daughter without frightening her. I told Maya a nice lady from the city needed to ask her a few questions about how things were going at home while Daddy was away. Maya looked at me, her small brow furrowed, sensing the deep current of terror I was desperately trying to hide. We returned to the house. I watched Mrs. Higgins lead my daughter into the living room and gently close the French doors. I stood in the kitchen for 45 minutes, staring at the digital clock on the microwave, listening to the muffled hum of their voices. I imagined Susan sitting in her immaculate, pristine house across town, sipping tea entirely insulated from the trauma she had just inflicted on her grandchild. Susan had not just ignored my plea for help. She had not simply sent a nasty email to my husband. To punish me for setting a legal boundary, she had actively engaged a system designed to remove children from dangerous environments. She was willing to risk Maya ending up in temporary state custody just to prove a point and reassert her dominance. The French doors opened. Mrs. Higgins emerged, followed closely by Maya. My daughter ran to me, wrapping her arms tightly around my waist, burying her face in my sweater. I held her, stroking her hair, my eyes locked on the investigator. Mrs. Higgins closed her notebook. She informed me that the preliminary visual assessment and the interview did not indicate any immediate life-threatening danger. She would not be removing Maya from the home today. However, the case would remain open. The investigation would proceed. She would be contacting Maya's school counselors, checking my medical releases, and conducting surprise follow-up visits. I was trapped in a bureaucratic nightmare, forced to prove my competence to a system that assumes guilt until innocence is documented. I watched Mrs. Higgins walk down my driveway and climb into her state-issued sedan. The taillights disappeared down the suburban street. I closed the front door, locked the deadbolt, and sank to the hardwood floor, pulling Maya into my lap. I realized the true cost of my impulsive retaliation. I was no longer fighting a cold war with a selfish relative. I was fighting the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania for the right to keep my child. The machinery of a state welfare investigation does not move quickly, nor does it care about the collateral damage left in its wake. The next 14 days transformed my home into a panopticon of bureaucratic scrutiny. I was trapped in an exhausting paradox. I had to fight fiercely to clear my name, but I had to do it with utter compliant docility. If I raised my voice in frustration, if I refused to answer a redundant question, or if I displayed the very natural anger of a mother falsely accused, it would be documented as erratic defensive behavior. I had to swallow my pride and smile through the humiliation. Mrs. Higgins was not a villain. She was simply a thorough agent of a system designed to expect the worst of human nature. Her skepticism was professional, yet it felt deeply personal. During her second unannounced visit, we sat in my living room, the space now rigidly clean and organized. I presented her with the verified invoice from the bonded nursing agency, proving the caregiver I hired the night of my surgery was fully licensed and background checked. I thought the paperwork would close the file. Mrs. Higgins reviewed the invoice, nodded slowly, and placed it in her folder. She did not offer a congratulatory smile. Instead, she leaned back in her chair and addressed the cease and desist letter Susan had undoubtedly provided her. She looked at me over the rim of her glasses. Families rarely escalate to formal legal threats unless there is a foundation of deep instability, she noted dryly. A healthy response to an argument is mediation, not a restraining order. The aggressiveness of your legal action suggests an environment of high conflict. Her logic was infuriatingly sound. To an outside observer, my impulsive retaliation looked exactly like the volatile behavior Susan alleged. I was spending my days dismantling the trap I had inadvertently helped build. To satisfy the parameters of the investigation, I needed external validation. I needed character references from people within my immediate community who could attest to my stability and Maya's welfare. This requirement forced me to confront the very isolation I had tried so hard to hide. I could not ask my coworkers. Exposing a Child Protective Services investigation at my corporate procurement job could jeopardize my career. I could not ask Marcus's military unit. The stigma would attach instantly to his command record. I was left with the neighborhood I had barely integrated into. I had to walk across my driveway and knock on the door of the young couple I had been too proud to wake on the night my appendix ruptured. The husband answered, looking confused. I stood on his porch, my cheeks burning with shame, and stripped away my privacy. I explained the surgery, the deployment, the vindictive mother-in-law, and the active government investigation. I watched their expressions shift from polite, neighborly distance to profound discomfort. I asked them to sign a sworn affidavit, affirming they had never witnessed me acting dangerously or neglecting my daughter. They signed it their pity, a heavy, suffocating weight I had to carry back across the lawn. The demands of the state escalated. Mrs. Higgins informed me that due to the specific allegations of severe maternal depression, a letter from my general practitioner was insufficient. I was mandated to undergo an independent, comprehensive psychological evaluation by a state-approved clinician. Wait times for these appointments were notoriously long, often stretching into months. I could not endure months of an open investigation hanging over my family. I had to bypass the queue. I found a private clinical psychologist willing to expedite the evaluation, but the accelerated timeline required an out-of-pocket payment. The cost was $1,500. I pulled out the emergency credit card again, the plastic surface feeling toxic against my fingers. I sat in a sterile office for 3 hours, answering invasive questions about my childhood, my marriage, my coping mechanisms, and my feelings toward my in-laws. I had to carefully monitor every response, ensuring I sounded rational and grounded, suppressing the urge to scream about the injustice of the situation. The financial hemorrhage was becoming catastrophic. Between the initial $3,000 retainer for the emergency night nurse, the fee for the discount online lawyer who drafted the disastrous cease and desist, and now the expedited psychological evaluation, my accounts were bleeding dry. The carefully managed budget Marcus and I had established was ruined. The stress of the financial collapse was a constant low-frequency hum beneath the primary terror of losing my child. The physical toll of managing this crisis while recovering from major abdominal surgery was visible. My incision site throbbed constantly, a sharp reminder of the night that started this chain reaction. I was losing weight, my clothes hanging loose on my frame. I drank coffee to stay awake during the day and stared at the ceiling fan all night, my mind racing through worst-case scenarios. But the most devastating cost was emotional, and it was exacted directly upon Maya. My 8-year-old daughter absorbed the tension in the house like a sponge. The unannounced visits from Mrs. Higgins, the hushed, frantic phone calls I took behind closed doors, and the sudden intense rigidity of our daily routine fractured her sense of security. Maya started acting out at school, her teacher emailing me about a sudden lack of focus and uncharacteristic outbursts of tears during recess. At home, the trauma manifested in the dark. Maya started having severe night terrors. I would wake up at 3 a.m. to the sound of her crying. I would rush down the hallway, fighting the pain in my stomach, to find her sitting upright in bed, clutching her blankets, her eyes wide with panic. She would ask me, her voice shaking, if the lady with the clipboard was coming back to take her away. She asked if Daddy was angry at us because he was not coming home to stop the lady. I would sit on the edge of her mattress, hold her small, trembling body against my chest, and lie. I told her everything was a big misunderstanding, and the lady just wanted to make sure we were safe. I sang softly to her until she fell back asleep, my own tears soaking the shoulder of my pajamas. I felt a profound, crushing guilt. I had brought this chaos into her life. If I had just taken the pain on that Friday night, if I had found a way to drive myself to the hospital without hiring the nurse, or if I had simply ignored Susan's mocking text message instead of retaliating with a legal threat, Maya would not be suffering. My desire to establish a boundary, my need to prove my independence had placed my daughter squarely in the crosshairs of a terrifying bureaucracy. Slowly, methodically, I was winning the logistical battle. The affidavits were filed. The psychological evaluation came back perfectly clean, documenting me as a highly functional, stable parent operating under extreme duress. The nursing agency provided exhaustive documentation of their protocols. Mrs. Higgins indicated that she was finalizing the paperwork to officially close the case as unfounded. On paper, I was clearing my name. I was proving Susan wrong, but as I sat at my kitchen table organizing the stack of legal and medical documents, listening to the quiet, anxious breathing of my daughter sleeping in the next room, I felt entirely defeated. The victory was hollow. Every success I secured against the state cost me a piece of my peace of mind, a chunk of my savings, and my daughter's innocence. While I was gathering the final financial statements required by Mrs. Higgins to prove I could adequately provide for Maya, I logged into the joint banking portal Marcus shared with his father. I needed a simple snapshot of our liquid assets to satisfy a bureaucratic checkbox. I clicked on the account summary, expecting a quick verification. Instead, the screen loaded and a string of numbers appeared that did not make sense. I blinked, rubbed my tired eyes, and looked closer. A cold, sharp realization pierced through the exhaustion. I forgot about the investigation. I forgot about the caseworker. My investigative instincts, honed by years of corporate procurement audits, flared to life. I started tracing the transaction history, unaware that the data on the screen was about to expose a secret so toxic it would shift the entire balance of power in our family dynamic. To satisfy the final demands of the state welfare investigation, I needed to submit a comprehensive overview of my financial standing. Mrs. Higgins required documented proof that I possessed the resources to maintain a stable household for Maya during my husband's overseas deployment. I sat at my kitchen table on a quiet Thursday morning, a fresh cup of coffee turning cold beside my laptop. My incisions still ached, but the fog of the past few weeks was beginning to lift, replaced by a grim determination to finish this bureaucratic ordeal. I opened multiple browser tabs, downloading statements from my checking account, my personal savings, and the primary household fund. There was one more account I needed to include. Years ago, Marcus had established a joint checking account with his father. The fund was designed to manage the taxes and emergency repairs for a small, aging lakeside cabin the family had inherited. Marcus, ever the diligent planner, insisted on keeping a strict $10,000 buffer in that specific account. He wanted to ensure that if the cabin roof leaked or the plumbing failed while he was away on military drills, David could handle the contractors without waiting for funds to clear. It was a gesture of profound trust between a son and his father. I navigated to the banking portal, typed in the shared credentials Marcus had left in our secure file, and waited for the dashboard to load. I only needed a quick PDF download to show the caseworker a healthy reserve balance. The screen refreshed. A blue banner appeared at the top of the page. I stared at the bold black numbers displayed under the account summary. The balance was $34.12. I blinked, shook my head, and hit the refresh button on my browser. I assumed it was a digital glitch. I thought perhaps the bank was undergoing routine maintenance, or I had accidentally clicked on a dormant sub-account. The page reloaded. The numbers remained identical. $34.12. A cold, sharp sensation pierced through my exhaustion. The anxiety that had governed my life for the past month evaporated, replaced instantly by the clinical forensic instincts I utilize every day in my profession. As a hospital procurement manager, I spend my life tracking missing inventory, identifying vendor discrepancies, and auditing supply chains. I know how to follow a paper trail. I clicked the cursor on the Transaction History tab and set the filter to display the past 6 months. I exported the data into a spreadsheet. I highlighted the columns and began to read the line items. The money had not vanished in a single catastrophic event. It had been systematically drained through a series of erratic, quiet withdrawals. The transfers were all outbound, moving directly from the joint buffer account into David's personal checking account. There were no descriptions attached to the movements. There were no invoices paid to roofing companies or local plumbers. There was just a steady, deliberate bleeding of funds. $500 here, $2,000 there. I cross-referenced the dates of the withdrawals on my spreadsheet with the calendar on my phone. My mind raced, pulling up memories of social media posts, family dinners, and casual conversations from the past half year. The puzzle pieces began to snap together with sickening clarity. In early August, there was a sudden transfer of $2,500. I checked my phone. That was the exact week Lauren had proudly announced on social media that she was signing a lease on a new upscale downtown loft, claiming her latest lifestyle brand was finally generating revenue. In mid-September, David had moved $1,200. That lined up perfectly with Susan's annual end-of-summer patio party, an extravagant catered affair, complete with an imported seafood bar and a live string quartet. I remembered attending that party, watching Susan accept compliments on her hosting skills while David stood quietly near the grill. Then my eyes landed on a major transaction in the first week of October. $4,000 had been withdrawn in a single day. I stopped breathing. The date corresponded to the exact week Susan had visited my house, drank my wine, and casually bragged about securing VIP Taylor Swift tickets on the resale market. She had framed it as a necessary mental health break for Lauren. The illusion of their upper-class comfort shattered right there on my laptop screen. My in-laws were not wealthy. They were not coasting on the secure retirement funds of a successful career. They were drowning in a sea of toxic, unmanageable debt, desperately trying to maintain a facade of elite status for their country club friends and social media followers. I understood the psychology of David in that moment. My father-in-law is a man who avoids conflict as if it were a physical threat. He lives in terror of Susan's dramatic outbursts and Lauren's emotional tantrums. Instead of sitting his demanding wife and entitled daughter down to explain that the money was gone, that the lifestyle brand had failed, and that they needed to drastically cut their expenses, David chose the path of least resistance. He chose cowardice. He quietly cannibalized his deployed son's emergency funds to keep the ship afloat. He stole from Marcus to buy peace in his own house. This financial revelation forced me to reevaluate everything that had happened over the past 2 months. The narrative I had constructed was fundamentally flawed. I thought back to the night my appendix ruptured. I remembered lying on the bathroom tiles begging Lauren and Susan to drive home and watch Maya. I had believed their refusal was born purely of selfish narcissism and a lack of empathy. But staring at the spreadsheet, a darker truth emerged. Susan did not just refuse to help me because she was entitled. She refused because she literally could not afford to abandon that trip. Those concert tickets and that non-refundable hotel room were the linchpins of her fake reality. They were purchased with stolen money and high-interest credit. To leave that stadium to drive back to the suburbs and admit the weekend was a wash would have forced her to face the precarious, crumbling nature of her finances. The tickets were a desperate attempt to keep up appearances. The stadium acoustics she bragged about in her text message were not just a taunt. They were the desperate flex of a bankrupt woman clinging to an illusion. Then the final, most terrifying realization hit me. I looked at the timeline of the Child Protective Services investigation. When I sent the formal cease and desist letter, I thought I had merely insulted Susan's pride. But to a family hiding deep financial fraud, a sudden legal threat from an estranged daughter-in-law is a flashing red siren. Susan knew Marcus trusted me. She knew it was only a matter of time before I reviewed the household accounts or stumbled across the joint fund. The anonymous tip to the state welfare agency was not just a vindictive act of revenge, it was a calculated strategic distraction. Susan weaponized the state to keep me entirely occupied. If I was spending my days calling lawyers, paying for expedited psychological evaluations, begging neighbors for affidavits, and comforting my terrified daughter, I was not auditing the family finances. The investigation was a smokescreen designed to keep me defensive, exhausted, and looking in the wrong direction, while David frantically tried to figure out a way to replace the stolen $10,000 before Marcus returned from his overseas deployment. They had risked my child's placement in the foster system to buy themselves time. I sat back in my chair. The low-frequency hum of fear that had vibrated in my chest since Mrs. Higgins first knocked on my door faded away. The anxiety over proving my competence to the state vanished. You cannot be intimidated by people once you discover their survival depends entirely on a lie. I highlighted the 4 months of fraudulent transfers. I hit the print command on my keyboard. The printer in the corner of the room whirred to life, spitting out 3 pages of undeniable evidence. I stacked the warm papers, neatly folded them, and slid them into a manila envelope. I was no longer the wounded military wife trying to clear her name. I was a procurement manager who had just caught a vendor stealing from the warehouse. I walked down the hallway, checked on Maya, who was quietly building a puzzle in her room, and told her to put on her shoes. We were going for a drive. I did not care about the cease and desist letter anymore. I was going to deliver these bank statements in person, and I was going to watch the foundation of their immaculate house crumble. The drive across town took 20 minutes, but it felt like a brief, surreal transition between 2 different worlds. I navigated my sedan through the winding, tree-lined streets of my in-laws' upscale neighborhood. The sprawling houses sat far back from the curb, boasting manicured lawns and pristine seasonal decorations. For years, I had viewed this enclave with a sense of quiet intimidation, believing it represented a tier of success and stability I had to earn my way into. Now, gripping the steering wheel with the printed bank statements resting on the passenger seat, I saw the neighborhood for what it truly was. It was a stage set. It was a fragile illusion maintained by desperate people. I pulled into the paved driveway and parked behind David's luxury sedan. I turned off the engine and looked at Maya in the rearview mirror. I could not leave her in the car, and I could not leave her at home. I handed her my digital tablet, queued up her favorite movie, and handed her a pair of noise-canceling headphones. I told her we were going to make a very quick stop to drop off some paperwork for her grandfather. We walked up the brick pathway together. I did not care about the legal parameters of the formal letter I had sent weeks prior. A cease and desist dictates the rules of harassment, not the rules of uncovering theft. I pressed the illuminated doorbell button and waited. The heavy oak door swung open. David stood in the foyer. He did not look like the stoic, comfortable patriarch who hosted holiday dinners and offered firm handshakes. He looked hollowed out. Dark circles framed his eyes, and his shoulders slumped beneath a wrinkled cardigan. He carried the distinct, suffocating weight of a man whose lies were rapidly reaching their expiration date. He glanced at my face, his eyes dropping briefly to the manila envelope in my hand. He did not ask why I was violating the boundary I had established. He simply stepped aside, leaving the entryway clear. I guided Maya to the formal sitting room near the front of the house. I settled her onto the plush velvet sofa, slipped the headphones over her ears, and made sure her eyes were glued to the glowing screen. Once she was secured in her own digital bubble, oblivious to the adult world, I turned and walked straight down the hallway into the immaculate chef's kitchen. Susan was not home. The silence in the large house was heavy, broken only by the low hum of a high-end refrigerator. I approached the gleaming marble island in the center of the room. I unclasped the metal tie of the envelope and slid the printed bank records across the smooth, cold stone. I flattened the papers with my palm and tapped my index finger on the final balance column, $34.12. I did not scream. I did not raise my voice or hurl dramatic insults. The time for emotional outbursts had ended the moment I saw the transaction history. I simply looked at my father-in-law and asked a single steady question. "Where is Marcus's money, David?" David stared at the papers. He did not attempt to deny the evidence. He did not feign ignorance or conjure a sudden creative excuse. The last remaining ounce of resistance drained out of him, leaving behind the pathetic reality of a profoundly weak man. He leaned his weight against the marble counter, bowing his head and burying his face in his trembling hands. There was no villainous monologue. There was no grand, sinister scheme orchestrated to ruin my life. There was only cowardice. He began to speak, his voice a ragged, breathless whisper, dismantling the facade his wife had spent decades building. He admitted they were 3 months behind on their mortgage payments. The bank had sent multiple notices, and they were teetering on the edge of formal foreclosure proceedings. The financial ruin stemmed directly from Lauren. Her latest lifestyle brand, the bespoke candle company she flaunted online to her followers, had failed spectacularly. It left a long trail of unpaid vendors, broken commercial leases, and steep legal fees. Instead of allowing their 30-year-old daughter to face the natural consequences of her poor business acumen, Susan had demanded a full bailout. Susan funneled their dwindling retirement savings into Lauren's debts, ignoring the mounting crisis in their own checking accounts. When Lauren spiraled into a depressive episode over her failed business and her recent romantic breakup, Susan decided a grand, extravagant gesture was necessary to lift her spirits. The concert tickets in Philadelphia, the luxury hotel suite, the expensive dinners and custom outfits. Those items were not purchased with disposable wealth. They were purchased using the emergency funds David had systematically drained from the joint account he shared with his deployed son. David confessed that Susan did not know the extent of the disaster. He had hidden the foreclosure notices in the garage. He had concealed the empty bank accounts managing the mail, so she never saw the final notices. He kept the illusion alive because he was terrified of his wife's reaction to poverty. He knew Susan's entire identity was wrapped in her social standing, and he lacked the courage to tell her the money was gone. David looked up at me, his eyes red and pleading. He reached across the marble island, his fingers hovering near the bank statements. He began to beg. "Holly, please," he whispered, his voice cracking. "If you tell Marcus while he is deployed, it will break him. He is in a combat zone. He needs to focus on his mission, not on our mistakes. I will pay it back. I will find a way to replace every dollar before his tour ends. Just give me time." Susan does not know how bad it is. If she finds out we are broke, the stress will destroy her. I stared at the man standing across from me, a cold realization settling over my skin. He was attempting to make me complicit in his financial infidelity. He was actively weaponizing his own son's military deployment to buy my silence. He framed his deceit as a noble sacrifice to protect Marcus, but the subtext was glaringly obvious. David genuinely believed that protecting Susan's fragile artificial reality was more important than the money he stole from his own child. He expected me to fall back into my old habits. He assumed the perpetual people-pleaser, the woman who had always smoothed over the rough edges for his family, would absorb this burden to keep the peace. He expected me to lie to my husband so his wife could continue playing the role of a wealthy socialite. The pieces of the past month slammed together, forming a horrifying picture. "You let her call the state?" I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Susan called Child Protective Services. She sent a government investigator to interrogate your granddaughter. She tried to have Maya taken away to punish me for the legal letter." David flinched, looking at the floor. "I tried to stop her, Holly. I told her it was a bad idea, but she was so angry." "You didn't try to stop her," I replied, the truth crystallizing in my mind. "You let her do it because you needed a distraction. You knew if I was busy fighting a caseworker and paying for psychological evaluations, I wouldn't have the time or energy to look at the joint bank account. You let my daughter suffer night terrors so you could hide your theft." David shook his head frantically, tears spilling onto his cheeks. He swore he never wanted Maya to get hurt, that things had just spiraled out of control. But his intentions did not matter. His weakness had endangered my child. I picked up the manila envelope, leaving the copies of the bank statements resting on the marble island. I did not offer him a timeline. I did not agree to keep his secret. I turned my back on him, walked into the sitting room, and tapped Maya on the shoulder. I took her hand, led her out the front door, and walked to my car without looking back at the house. I sat in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel, while Maya resumed her game in the back. I had the truth. I had the evidence. But holding the truth felt like holding a live grenade. To protect my daughter and my marriage, I was going to have to pull the pin, knowing the explosion would reach a man sleeping in a combat zone thousands of miles away. I drove the 20 minutes back to my house in total silence. The radio switched off. My hands gripping the leather steering wheel so tightly my joints ached. The suburban landscape rolling past my windows looked exactly the same as it had an hour ago, but the foundational reality of my life had shifted. This quiet commute was my crucible. The internal war between the woman I used to be and the woman I was forced to become waged with every mile marker I passed. The old version of myself, The perpetual people pleaser who funded Lauren's absurd websites to buy a scrap of affection would have covered for David. She would have hidden the debt to keep the peace. The old Holly viewed her husband's military deployment as a sacred bubble that required total protection. I knew Marcus was sleeping on a narrow cot in a hostile environment, working grueling logistical shifts to ensure his unit had the supplies they needed to survive. The old Holly would have swallowed the theft, drained her own personal savings to replace the missing $10,000, and smiled through the video screen to assure her husband that his family back in Pennsylvania was functioning perfectly. But the old Holly died on a cold bathroom floor while her mother-in-law listened to stadium pop music. The woman who survived a ruptured appendix alone, the mother who had to subject her innocent daughter to a humiliating government interrogation because of these people could no longer operate in the shadows. I could not be complicit in David's financial infidelity. To protect his cowardice meant leaving my daughter exposed to Susan's unpredictable vengeance. I pulled into my driveway, turned off the ignition, and sat in the quiet cabin of my car for a long moment. I had to make a choice that carried a terrible, unavoidable price. I was about to detonate a bomb in my husband's life, and I had to do it across a fragile satellite connection while he was wearing a uniform. I guided Maya inside, prepared a simple dinner, and helped her through her evening routine. Once she was tucked into bed, dreaming safely under her star-shaped nightlight, I walked into my home office. I opened my laptop, checked the connection signal, and stared at the dark screen. The scheduled video call was set for 9 o'clock my time. I arranged the printed bank statements neatly next to my keyboard. I took a slow, deep breath, trying to steady the frantic beating of my heart. The application chimed. The screen flickered, struggling through a few seconds of digital artifacting before resolving into the image of my husband. Marcus looked exhausted. Deep shadows hung under his eyes, and his uniform was dusted with the pale, fine grit of his environment. He offered a tired but genuine smile, leaning close to the camera lens. He asked me how my day was, his voice carrying that familiar, comforting timbre I had missed so desperately. This was the moment. The instinct to lie, to plaster a bright smile on my face, and recount a mundane story about Maya's school project clawed at my throat. It is the instinct every military spouse develops to shield their partner from domestic burdens. I forced it down. I looked into the camera, keeping my expression steady and unreadable. I did not smile. I told him we needed to have a very difficult conversation. I watched his posture change instantly. The relaxed slope of his shoulders vanished, replaced by the rigid, alert stance of a soldier anticipating an operational failure. He asked me if Maya was safe. I assured him she was asleep and physically unharmed, but I clarified that our safety had been severely compromised. I laid it all out. I utilized the same clinical, methodical tone I used during intense procurement audits at the hospital. I removed all emotion from my delivery, presenting the sequence of events as a factual timeline. I started with the night of the surgery. I recounted the unanswered phone calls, Lauren's irritation, and Susan's refusal to leave the concert. I explained the necessity of the emergency nurse and the subsequent hospital stay. Marcus listened, his jaw tightening, the muscles working visibly beneath his skin. He did not interrupt. I moved to the retaliation. I admitted my mistake in sending the legal letter, owning my impulsive choice without making excuses. Then I explained Susan's countermeasure. I told him about the knock on the door, the state badge, and Mrs. Higgins stepping into our living room. I described the sheer terror of watching a government investigator question his 8-year-old daughter behind closed doors because his mother filed an anonymous fabricated report claiming I was a drug-addicted, negligent parent. The color drained from Marcus's face. The pixelated image on the screen could not hide the profound shock registering in his eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, a defensive reflex to rationalize his mother's behavior, but I raised my hand. I told him I was not finished. I picked up the bank statements and held them up to the camera lens. I told him I needed to provide financial documentation to clear my name with the state. I explained that I logged into the joint account he shared with his father, expecting to find the $10,000 buffer. I told him the balance was $34. I detailed the transaction history. I listed the dates and the exact amounts David had systematically withdrawn over the past 4 months. I connected those withdrawals to Lauren's apartment lease and Susan's lavish holiday parties. Finally, I relayed the confession David had offered in his pristine kitchen just hours ago. I told Marcus that his parents were 3 months behind on their mortgage, facing imminent foreclosure and drowning in toxic debt. I explained that David stole his emergency funds to keep Susan from discovering they were broke. I watched my husband shatter on a digital screen. It was the hardest thing I have ever done. To see the man I love, a man carrying the heavy burden of a combat deployment, absorb the ultimate betrayal from his own blood was agonizing. His eyes squeezed shut. He pressed the heels of his hands against his forehead, his elbows resting on whatever makeshift desk he was using in his bunker. He looked physically ill. I sat in my quiet office, staring at his fractured image, and felt the heavy, bitter cost of my truth. I had achieved clarity, but I had cost him his peace of mind in a war zone. It was a strategic and emotional loss that I will always regret having to inflict. A soldier requires intense mental focus to stay alive and keep his unit safe. I had just introduced a chaotic, devastating distraction into his mind, and neither of us could reach through the screen to comfort the other. The silence stretched for a long time. The satellite connection hissed softly. I gave him the space to mourn the illusion of his family. I waited, knowing that whatever he said next would determine the survival of our marriage. When Marcus finally lowered his hands, the grief in his expression had hardened into something cold and sharp. The diplomat, the buffer who always smoothed over his family's toxic behavior, was gone. He looked directly into the camera lens, his eyes dark and resolute. His voice carried a hard metallic edge I had never heard before. He issued instructions with the precise authority of his rank. He told me to log into every financial portal we possessed and freeze all remaining accounts. He instructed me to remove his father's name from any shared assets immediately. He told me to stop communicating with his family, to lock the doors, and to refuse any further contact. "Do whatever you have to do to protect Maya," he said, the words heavy and final. "You are my only priority. I will deal with my father when I get home." The call ended shortly after the screen going black, leaving me staring at my own faint reflection in the glass. The revelation had inflicted profound damage. We were fractured, separated by thousands of miles, and a sprawling family betrayal. But as I closed my laptop and locked my office door, I realized something vital. For the first time since I married into his family, Marcus and I were finally united. We were standing on the same side of the boundary. The truth was out, the funds were frozen, and the protective wall around my house was sealed. But the financial implosion David had desperately tried to delay was accelerating. My in-laws were out of money, out of borrowed time, and stripped of their secret safety net. I knew the quiet would not last, because a house built on toxic debt and fragile pride does not fall silently. The financial collapse of my in-laws did not happen in secret. A house built on a foundation of toxic debt and fragile pride does not fall quietly. It falls with a very loud, very public crash. Exactly 2 weeks after I sat in my home office and watched my husband instruct me to freeze his remaining assets, the final plug holding back their floodwaters was pulled. Without the stolen $10,000 to appease the lenders, David's desperate juggling act reached its inevitable conclusion. The bank transitioned from sending automated warning letters to initiating formal legal action. A process server wearing a nondescript windbreaker and carrying a thick manila envelope walked up their manicured brick pathway one sunny Tuesday afternoon. He handed David the official notice of default. Within 48 hours, the foreclosure proceedings were filed with the county clerk. In the digital age, county records are not hidden in dusty basement filing cabinets. They are scraped by automated real estate websites, published in local business journals, and circulated in neighborhood online forums. The illusion of their upper-class comfort shattered for the entire world to see. The first casualty of this newly exposed reality was Lauren. My sister-in-law had spent her entire 30 years treating her parents like an endless, magical repository of funding. She had been conditioned by Susan to believe that her mere existence entitled her to luxury. When the money stopped flowing, the toxic dynamic Susan had carefully cultivated finally turned inward. The breaking point arrived in the form of a tow truck. Lauren was leasing a luxury import SUV, a vehicle she frequently featured in her social media posts, to project the image of a successful travel influencer. David had been quietly covering those lease payments for 2 years. When he stopped paying, the dealership did not care about her online follower count. A recovery agent arrived at her upscale downtown apartment complex in the middle of the night and towed the vehicle away. Lauren was stranded, furious, and suddenly confronted with the reality of her own financial incompetence. She called David, demanding he fix the situation immediately. For the first time in his life, my father-in-law had to utter a terrifying, simple truth. He told his daughter the money was gone. He explained that the bank was taking their house and he could not bail her out. I learned about the ensuing fallout from Aunt Ruth, who relayed the events to me over the phone with a tone of grim disbelief. Lauren did not rally to help the parents who had sacrificed their retirement to fund her whims. She did not offer to find a stable job and contribute to their legal defense. True to the exact nature she had been taught, Lauren threw a spectacular punishing tantrum. She drove a rental car to their house, stood in their pristine chef's kitchen, and blamed them for ruining her credit score. She screamed that they had failed her. She packed her expensive designer luggage, informed Susan she was moving to Texas to live with a man she had been dating for 3 weeks, and walked out the front door. She abandoned them the moment they ceased to be useful. The departure of her golden child was a devastating blow to Susan, but the social exile that followed was the strike that truly dismantled her identity. Susan had spent decades prioritizing the opinions of her country club peers over the well-being of her own family. Those friendships were entirely transactional, based on a mutual performance of perceived wealth. The moment the foreclosure notice became public neighborhood gossip, the invisible social walls closed in. The wealthy women who had attended Susan's lavish end-of-summer patio party stopped returning her calls. Her name was quietly removed from the charity luncheon planning committees. When she showed up for her weekly tennis clinic, she found herself greeted with polite, icy distance before being swiftly excluded from the post-game lunches. Her peers scented financial blood in the water and swam away. The very people Susan had tried to impress by abandoning me on the night of my surgery now viewed her as a cautionary tale to be avoided. While Susan was experiencing the brutal reality of isolation, I walked out to my mailbox. Sitting among the grocery store flyers and utility bills was a standard unmarked government envelope. I carried it inside, sat at the same kitchen table where I had uncovered David's theft, and sliced the paper open. It was the final report from Mrs. Higgins and the Department of Human Services. The document was written in dry, bureaucratic language, but the conclusion was unmistakable. The investigation was officially closed. The allegations of maternal depression, substance abuse, and child neglect were deemed entirely unfounded. The state had reviewed the psychological evaluations, the neighbor affidavits, and the nursing agency credentials. The final paragraph noted that my household provided a stable, nurturing, and secure environment for my daughter. I set the letter down on the wood-grain surface. The irony was so profound it felt heavy in my lungs. Susan had called Child Protective Services in a vindictive attempt to prove I was an unfit mother living in chaos. She had tried to weaponize the government to tear my family apart. Instead, her actions forced the state to conduct a rigorous audit of my life, an audit that ultimately generated official documented proof of my competence and stability. I had survived the crucible. Meanwhile, the architect of that investigation was currently sitting in a house she no longer owned, abandoned by the daughter she had worshipped and shunned by the social circle she had prioritized above all else. Susan and David had engineered their own destruction through a lethal combination of pride and profound financial incompetence. They tried to bury me to hide their own failures, but the truth always demands a balancing of the ledger. I watched the consequences unfold from a distance. Aunt Ruth kept me informed, her voice a mix of sorrow for her brother and quiet vindication for me. I did not feel any joy hearing about their ruin. There was no triumphant celebration in my house. Gloating requires a level of emotional investment I no longer possessed. I felt only a cold clinical validation of everything I had known for years. The red flags I had ignored, the transactional affection I had tried to buy, the constant feeling of never being good enough. It was all symptoms of a deeply diseased system. I was finally free of it. I focused on my physical recovery, which improved rapidly once the stress of the state investigation lifted. I focused on Maya, whose night terrors faded as the rigid tension in our house dissolved into a calm, predictable routine. I focused on my job at the hospital network, channeling my energy into the precise, logical world of procurement and supply chains. I spoke to Marcus on a secure line, our conversations shifting away from the domestic trauma and returning to the quiet, steady partnership we had almost lost. We were healing. But desperate people do not simply fade into the background. When a drowning person runs out of air, they will reach for anything that floats, even the very person they previously tried to sink. Susan and David had exhausted their credit. They had lost their social standing. Their golden child had fled across the country. They were staring down a firm, impending eviction date with nowhere to go. I knew they were aware of a specific financial asset. They knew Marcus and I maintained a high-yield savings account containing $30,000 carefully earmarked to cover Maya's future college tuition. It was the only liquid capital left in our family tree. I anticipated a phone call. I expected a lengthy pleading email filled with empty promises of repayment. I thought David might attempt to contact Marcus through his military command channels. I prepared myself to intercept any digital communication. I did not expect them to show up at my property. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, the gray sky casting long shadows across my front lawn, the motion sensor on my security camera chimed. I picked up my phone and watched the live video feed. I saw a familiar luxury sedan pull into my driveway. The engine turned off, and the doors opened, bringing the consequences of their collapse right to my doorstep. Desperation destroys pride. It strips away the carefully cultivated layers of social conditioning and leaves behind a raw, naked instinct for survival. People who have spent their entire lives looking down on others will abruptly change their posture when they realize they are standing at the bottom of a very deep hole. I learned this lesson by watching a high-definition security feed on a rainy Thursday afternoon. The digital chime of my security application interrupted the quiet hum of my home office. I was reviewing a quarterly supply chain report for the hospital network, a task that required deep focus. I minimized the spreadsheet and pulled up the live camera feed. The weather outside was dismal, a steady gray Pennsylvania drizzle that turned the pavement slick and dark. A familiar vehicle was parked awkwardly in my driveway. It was David's luxury sedan, the same car they had used to drive to a stadium pop concert while my appendix ruptured. The driver's side door opened. David stepped out into the rain. A moment later, Susan emerged from the passenger side. I watched them walk up the concrete path toward my front porch. The high-resolution lens captured a striking visual transformation. They looked physically diminished. The confident, expansive aura they used to project at holiday parties and country club luncheons had vanished. Their expensive designer clothing coats that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage suddenly seemed oversized and foolish on their slumping frames. They looked like actors who had shown up to a theater only to realize the play had been canceled weeks ago. They stood under the awning of my porch. David reached out a trembling hand and pressed the doorbell. I did not panic. The anxiety that used to paralyze me whenever my in-laws were displeased was entirely absent. I felt a steady, cold resolve settle into my chest. I closed my laptop, walked down the hallway, and paused by the entryway mirror to check my reflection. I wore a simple sweater and jeans. My hair was tied back. I looked like a mother, a professional, a woman who owned the ground she stood on. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy door open. I did not step aside to invite them in. I stood firmly on the threshold, blocking the entrance with my body. David spoke first. His voice lacked any trace of the polite, non-committal authority he used to wield. He sounded ragged, the vocal cords strained by weeks of sleepless nights and mounting terror. The rain drummed against the gutters above us, a steady rhythm beneath his desperate words. He skipped the pleasantries. He did not ask how my surgical recovery was progressing or how his granddaughter was doing in school. He launched straight into the logistics of their ruin. He told me the bank had moved past the preliminary foreclosure notices. They were now operating under a strict legal deadline. The lending institution had granted them exactly 10 days to cure the default on their mortgage. If they did not produce the required funds within that narrow window, the property would be seized and they would be formally evicted. He named the figure required to halt the process. They needed $30,000. David looked at me, rainwater dripping from the brim of his coat. He did not mention the $10,000 he had already stolen from his son's emergency buffer. He did not acknowledge that he had breached my trust long before this moment. He simply stated the required amount, his eyes locked onto mine with a sickening expectation. He knew that exact figure was sitting in my financial portfolio. 3 years ago, during a rare family dinner where Marcus was discussing long-term financial planning, he had proudly mentioned our high-yield savings account. He had told his parents that we had managed to save $30,000, specifically earmarked as the foundational investment for Maya's future college tuition. David had stored that information away. Now facing total ruin, he was attempting to access his granddaughter's educational future to bail himself out of a disaster he had engineered. He stood on my porch, a man asking a mother to sacrifice her child's future to pay for his past mistakes. Before I could respond to David's request, Susan stepped forward. She brushed past her husband, positioning herself directly in my line of sight. She was attempting to summon her old, formidable authority, trying to mask her raw panic with a brittle layer of indignation. She squared her shoulders and looked at me, attempting to utilize the same tone she used when she criticized my holiday centerpieces or complained about her credit card interest rates. "Holly," she said, her voice sharp and urgent. "We are family. We have had our disagreements recently and tensions have been high, but you cannot let your husband's parents end up on the street. It would destroy Marcus. He is serving our country. You cannot allow this kind of tragedy to happen to his mother and father while he is deployed." I stared at her. The sheer audacity of her statement hung in the damp air between us. They were standing on my porch demanding $30,000, yet neither of them offered a single word of apology. There was no remorse for abandoning me on the night of my surgery. There was no explanation for why a stadium concert was more important than my physical survival. Most chillingly, there was absolutely no acknowledgement of the Child Protective Services investigation. Susan had tried to use the power of the state to remove my daughter from my custody just weeks prior, and now she was invoking the sacred bond of family to demand a financial bailout. She was trying to leverage the very concept of kinship that she had casually discarded when I was bleeding on my bathroom floor. I understood their strategy. They were relying on my historical pattern of behavior. They knew me as the accommodator, the anxious daughter-in-law who financed Lauren's websites and absorbed insults to maintain a fragile peace. They believed that when pushed to the absolute brink, my innate desire to avoid conflict and my fear of causing Marcus pain would override my anger. They assumed the guilt of watching them lose their home would force my hand. They expected me to cave. They were operating under an outdated paradigm. They thought they were negotiating with the woman who wanted to buy her way into their inner circle. They did not realize they had walked right into the boundary I had finally learned to hold. The silence stretched on the porch. David looked hopeful. Susan looked defiant, her chin raised, waiting for me to step back and invite them inside to discuss the wire transfer details. I did not move. I looked at the two people who had nearly cost me my life and my child. I felt the weight of the past decade lift off my shoulders. I was no longer afraid of their judgment or their social standing. I was immune to their manipulation. I prepared to deliver a response that would shatter their expectations and sever our toxic connection permanently. I was about to drop a sequence of facts that would leave them with nowhere left to run. I stood on the threshold of my home with the cold rain dampening the edge of my porch. I looked at the two people who had expected me to fold. They stood there waiting for the familiar routine. They expected me to lower my eyes. They thought I would apologize for the tension, invite them inside out of the weather, and start calculating how quickly I could transfer $30,000 to save their reputation. I did not lower my eyes. I did not yell. I did not cry. I did not hurl dramatic insults into the wet afternoon air. Raising my voice would have implied that they still had the power to destabilize my emotions. Crying would have signaled that their actions still possessed the ability to wound me. I felt neither panic nor sorrow. I felt the cold, precise clarity of a woman who had spent weeks surviving an active siege and had finally disarmed the enemy. I locked my gaze onto the woman who had tried to take my child. "Susan," I said. My voice was dangerously calm. It was the flat, even tone of a professional terminating a fraudulent contract. "3 weeks ago, you picked up a telephone and filed a false report with the state. You told a government investigator that I was a danger to Maya. You tried to use the child welfare system to remove my daughter from her home. You subjected an 8-year-old girl to an interrogation by a stranger because you were embarrassed by a legal letter." Susan blinked. The confident, indignant mask she had worn just seconds prior began to slip. Her mouth opened, but her usual quick, cutting remarks failed to materialize. Confronted with the stark, unvarnished reality of her own actions spoken aloud, the illusion of her maternal superiority crumbled. She was not a caring grandmother protecting her family. She was a vindictive woman who had weaponized a child to soothe a bruised ego. Before she could gather her wits to manufacture a defense, I turned my attention to my father-in-law. I reached to the console table just inside my entryway. I picked up the manila envelope I had prepared days ago. I stepped forward and pressed it directly into David's chest. He reflexively brought his hands up to grasp it. He looked down at the thick package. He did not need to open the flap to know what was inside. His face drained of whatever color the cold rain had brought to his cheeks. "David." I continued keeping my volume low and steady. "That envelope contains the printed bank statements from the joint account you share with Marcus. You stole $10,000 from your son while he is deployed in a combat zone. You drained his emergency reserve to pay for concert tickets and your 30-year-old daughter's downtown rent. You prioritized a pop music tour over the financial security of a soldier." David stared at the manila envelope as if it were burning his palms. His shoulders slumped forward. He did not attempt to deny the accusation. He knew the paper trail was undeniable. He had spent months operating under the cowardly assumption that his theft would go unnoticed until he could miraculously replace the funds. Now, holding the physical proof of his betrayal, the crushing weight of his reality paralyzed him. Susan, however, could not tolerate the silence. A narcissist facing total exposure will always attempt to rewrite the narrative. She saw her husband defeated. She saw her demands rejected. She realized the leverage she thought she possessed was entirely non-existent. She scrambled for a foothold. Her eyes darted around the porch, searching for a deflection. She opened her mouth, inhaling sharply to launch into a defensive tirade. She wanted to play the victim. She was preparing to tell me how hard her life had been, how Lauren needed support, how the foreclosure was an unfair twist of fate. She wanted to twist the theft and the government investigation into a story where she was the misunderstood martyr. I cut her off before she could form a single syllable. "I am not angry anymore," I said, slicing through her rising breath. "I am just finished. Maya's college fund is protected. It is secured in an account you cannot access and you cannot leverage. You will not see a single dime of that money. We are not going to save your house. We are not going to fund your lifestyle. And you are not going to see us." I did not wait for a rebuttal. I did not give them the opportunity to plead, to argue, or to offer empty promises of future repayment. I took one deliberate step backward into my foyer. I maintained eye contact with Susan until the very last second, ensuring she understood the absolute permanence of my decree. I pushed the heavy oak door shut. The sound of the wood settling into the frame was solid and deeply satisfying. I reached up and turned the brass deadbolt. The metallic click of the lock sliding into place echoed through the quiet entryway. In that moment, it was the loudest, most definitive sound in the world. It was the sound of a decade-long burden finally hitting the floor. I did not walk away immediately. I turned to the digital security monitor mounted on the wall. The live camera feed displayed the front porch. Susan and David stood frozen under the awning. The rain continued to fall, blowing sideways and dampening their expensive coats. They looked like statues left behind in a forgotten garden. David stared down at the manila envelope in his hands, his posture defeated and broken. Susan stared at the closed door, her face a portrait of profound, bewildered shock. She raised her hand halfway as if she intended to knock again, but her fingers curled into a loose fist and dropped back to her side. They remained on that porch for 10 full minutes. I watched the digital timer on the security feed count the seconds. They did not speak to each other. They did not argue. They simply stood in the cold, damp air, absorbing the reality that their final safety net had vanished. They had played their last card, and the table had been swept clean. Eventually, David turned. He walked slowly down the brick pathway, his head bowed against the weather. Susan lingered for a few seconds longer, her eyes fixed on the peephole, before she turned and followed him. They climbed into the luxury sedan they could no longer afford. The engine started, the headlights pierced the gloomy afternoon, and the car reversed out of my driveway. I watched them drive away into the wreckage of their own making. They were returning to a house the bank was about to seize. They were returning to a social circle that had abandoned them and a daughter who had fled the moment the funds dried up. They had engineered every single aspect of their own destruction. I stood in my quiet, secure home. The chaotic noise they always brought with them was gone. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a fresh glass of water, and felt a profound sense of peace settle over my household. I had protected my child. I had secured our financial future. I had defended my deployed husband from a catastrophic theft. The battle was over, but the aftermath of a war always requires a period of careful reconstruction. Marcus was scheduled to return from his overseas deployment in 3 months, and we had a fractured foundation to rebuild. Marcus returned from his overseas deployment 3 months later. The transition from late winter into early spring had mirrored my own internal shift. The ice had thawed, leaving behind a landscape that required significant clearing and careful cultivation. The day he arrived, the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. I stood in our driveway with Maya watching the transport vehicle pull to a stop near the curb. When Marcus stepped out, the breath caught in my throat. He looked thinner, the lines around his eyes etched deeper by the stress of a combat zone and the heavy burden of a fractured family. Maya ran to him, her small shoes slapping against the pavement. He dropped his heavy olive-drab duffel bag and dropped to his knees, catching our daughter in a tight, desperate embrace. He buried his face in her shoulder, holding her as if she were the only anchor keeping him tethered to the earth. I walked toward them slowly, feeling the familiar sting of tears welling in my eyes. When Marcus stood up and wrapped his arms around me, the embrace was fierce and unyielding. We held each other in the warm afternoon sun, presenting a picture of a joyful military homecoming. But beneath the surface, our reunion was shadowed by the undeniable reality of what we had survived in his absence. We were two exhausted soldiers returning from different fronts, carrying the invisible wounds of a shared conflict. We did not immediately discuss his parents. We spent the first week focusing entirely on recalibrating our household. We relearned the simple rhythms of eating dinner together, helping Maya with her homework, and sitting on the couch in the quiet hours of the evening. Marcus needed time to decompress from the hyper-vigilant state of a deployment, and I needed time to trust that the safety net I had woven for myself was truly secure. However, unresolved betrayal demands eventual attention. During his second week home, Marcus addressed the wreckage. He did not invite his parents over for a tense mediation. He did not arrange a neutral meeting at a local coffee shop to hash out their grievances. He opted for a venue that stripped away any opportunity for emotional manipulation or theatrical victimhood. Marcus scheduled a meeting at a corporate law firm located in the downtown business district. I did not attend. I stayed home working in my office and keeping Maya company. Marcus wore a dark civilian suit, projecting the formal authority of his military rank without the uniform. When he returned home that afternoon, he sat at the kitchen table, loosened his tie, and recounted the events with a quiet, solemn detachment. He described the sterile environment of the conference room. The mahogany table, the leather chairs, and the presence of a hired attorney served as an impenetrable barrier against Susan's usual tactics. When his parents arrived, they looked diminished. David carried a battered folder containing their financial disclosures. Susan attempted to initiate small talk, offering a trembling smile and reaching out to hug her son. Marcus stepped back, refusing the embrace. He instructed them to sit down. The meeting lasted less than an hour. The attorney produced a stack of documents designed to formally sever all financial ties between Marcus and his father. They closed the joint checking account, transferring the remaining $34 to David just to clear the ledger. They signed binding declarations, removing Marcus as an authorized user or guarantor on any old credit lines David had opened years ago. Marcus systematically dismantled every potential avenue his parents could use to access our resources or leverage our credit history. Susan tried to cry. She tried to recount the story of the Taylor Swift concert, spinning a narrative where she was a misunderstood mother trying to cure Lauren's depression. She attempted to blame me for escalating the situation, claiming my legal letter had forced her to call the state welfare agency out of genuine concern. Marcus did not engage. He looked at his mother across the polished wood grain and delivered a response that finalized the fracture. He told her that a caring grandmother does not unleash a government investigator on an 8-year-old child to win an argument. He stated that a responsible father does not steal emergency funds from a deployed soldier to fund a luxury hotel stay. He informed them that their actions had disqualified them from the privilege of participating in his life. When the paperwork was finalized and the signatures were notarized, Marcus stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked out of the conference room. He left his parents sitting there in the echoing silence of a legal office. He did not offer a final goodbye. He simply walked to the elevator, rode it down to the lobby, and drove home to the family he had chosen to protect. The consequences of their profound financial incompetence materialized swiftly. Without the stolen funds to appease the lending institution, the bank finalized the foreclosure. The sprawling, immaculate house with the chef's kitchen and the manicured lawn was seized. The property was listed for public auction, the glossy photographs serving as a digital monument to their ruined facade. Susan and David were forced to vacate the premises. Stripped of their credit and lacking the income to secure a premium rental, they moved into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a sprawling anonymous complex on the opposite side of the county. The complex sat adjacent to a busy highway, replacing the quiet serenity of their former neighborhood with the constant drone of commercial traffic. The pristine marble countertops were traded for chipped formica. The imported floral centerpieces were replaced by the harsh glare of fluorescent overhead lighting. Their social circle, the wealthy peers Susan had sacrificed her family to impress, remained conspicuously absent. There were no housewarming gifts or offers of assistance from the country club. They were exiled to the invisible margins of the community they used to rule. The most bitter irony of their new existence was the behavior of their golden child. Lauren did not step up to support the parents who had ruined their retirement to fund her endless lifestyle brands. Upon discovering that the bank of Mom and Dad was permanently closed, Lauren had fled to Texas with a new romantic partner. She rarely contacts them. She does not send financial assistance. She posts heavily filtered photographs of her new life on social media, showcasing expensive dinners and weekend getaways, entirely indifferent to the fact that her parents are living in a cramped apartment near a highway. Susan and David raised a daughter who views relationships purely through a transactional lens. When they ceased to provide premium funding, she ceased to play the role of a loving child. They engineered their own isolation, trading a son who would have cared for them in their old age for a daughter who abandoned them the moment the well ran dry. While my in-laws navigated the grim reality of their new circumstances, Marcus and I began the arduous process of repairing our own foundation. Surviving a crisis does not mean a marriage is automatically healed. The deployment, the medical emergency, and the relentless legal chaos had frayed the edges of our trust. Marcus carried a heavy burden of guilt. He blamed himself for leaving me vulnerable, for trusting his parents, and for not recognizing the warning signs of his father's weakness. I harbored my own residual resentment. For years, I had molded myself into a perpetual people-pleaser, funding Lauren's websites and hosting lavish dinners because I felt an unspoken pressure to accommodate his family. The unspoken expectation that I should constantly sacrifice my comfort for their approval had created a deep, quiet anger that needed to be addressed. We recognized that love alone was not sufficient to bridge the gap. We required professional guidance. We dedicated ourselves to months of intensive couples therapy. Every Thursday evening, we sat in a quiet, softly lit office with a licensed counselor unpacking a decade of poor boundaries and unexpressed grievances. The conversations were frequently agonizing. We had to confront the ugly truth that my desire to buy a family had enabled Susan's entitlement, and his desire to avoid conflict had allowed his father's theft. We learned how to communicate our fears without resorting to defensive postures. We established new, rigid protocols for our extended family interactions, ensuring that my safety and Maya's security would always supersede any social obligation. The therapy was exhausting, requiring a level of emotional vulnerability that left us both drained, but it slowly knit the fractured pieces of our partnership back together into a stronger, more resilient configuration. The cost of this hard-won peace was not merely emotional. The financial toll of the ordeal was severe. We spent long evenings sitting at our kitchen table reviewing spreadsheets and restructuring our long-term goals. The $3,000 retainer for the emergency night nurse, the fees for the initial online lawyer, and the exorbitant cost of the expedited psychological evaluation had drained our liquid savings. The money we had painstakingly set aside for a new heating and cooling system was gone. We had to cancel our planned summer vacation, replacing a week at the beach with quiet weekends at local public parks. We tightened our grocery budget, delayed necessary vehicle maintenance, and funneled every spare dollar into rebuilding our emergency reserve. The $30,000 in Maya's college fund remained securely locked away, untouched and protected, but our daily operational buffer was precariously thin. The victory I secured on my front porch was not flawless. The peace I won was incredibly expensive, paid for with tears, public humiliation, and drained accounts. There is no triumphant cinematic parade when you cut toxic relatives out of your life. There is only the quiet, heavy reality of moving forward with fewer resources and a lingering sense of grief for the family you wished you had. But true clarity arrives in the quiet moments. Every night before I turn off the hallway lights, I walk into my daughter's bedroom. The room is peaceful, illuminated by the familiar glow of her star-shaped nightlight. I stand in the doorway and watch Maya sleep. Her breathing is deep and even. The night terrors that plagued her during the state investigation have vanished entirely. She no longer wakes up crying, terrified that a stranger with a clipboard is coming to take her away. She goes to school with a light heart, secure in the knowledge that her home is an impenetrable sanctuary. I look at her resting safely under her blankets, and I know the cost was worth it. Every dollar spent on that emergency nurse, every humiliating question answered during the psychological evaluation, every ounce of strength it took to close my front door on my in-laws, it was a necessary sacrifice to ensure her safety. I used to hold a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of boundaries. For years, I believed that setting a boundary was an aggressive act, a harsh wall built specifically to punish other people. I thought saying no made me a difficult, rigid person. I allowed my in-laws to trample over my dignity because I was terrified of being perceived as unkind. Now, having survived the crucible of their betrayal, I understand the truth. Boundaries are not weapons of punishment. They are the sturdy doors you install to protect the peace of your own home. You have the sovereign right to determine who is allowed to walk through that frame. You can choose to keep the door locked when the people on the outside refuse to wipe their muddy feet before stepping onto your floors. You do not have to watch the people who hurt you fall apart. You can step back and allow them to experience the natural consequences of their own destructive behavior. You do not owe them a rescue. Most importantly, you do not have to set yourself on fire simply to keep toxic people warm. I spent a decade operating under the desperate delusion that I could purchase affection. I financed websites, curated holiday menus, and swallowed insults, hoping that a transactional approach would eventually yield genuine love. I finally stopped trying to buy a family. I stopped negotiating my worth with people who viewed me as a convenient commodity. In walking away from the illusion, I discovered my own profound strength. By closing the door on the family I wished I had, I successfully protected the beautiful, resilient family I already possessed. The journey from a terrified woman lying on a bathroom floor to a mother standing firmly at the threshold of her own life was brutal and exhausting. It changed the way I view trust, duty, and the limits of obligation. Looking back on the wreckage and the subsequent rebuilding, there are fundamental truths that emerged from the chaos, stark lessons carved out of necessity that will govern the rest of my life. First, transactional love is an endless, devastating scam. If your inclusion in a family circle depends on your constant utility, your financial contributions, or your willingness to absorb mistreatment without complaint, You are not a family member. You are a resource. You can never buy the respect of people who are determined to view you as inferior. The moment your usefulness runs out, or the moment you require assistance, their affection will evaporate. Real love does not keep a ledger. Second, a crisis does not create a person's character. It merely removes their mask. When my appendix ruptured, Susan did not suddenly become a selfish person. The pressure of the emergency simply stripped away the polite social veneer, revealing the entitlement that was always present. When faced with the threat of foreclosure, David did not suddenly turn into a thief. The desperation just forced his inherent cowardice into the light. Pay attention to how people behave when the stakes are high and their comfort is threatened. That is who they truly are. Third, a boundary is a mechanism for survival, not a tool for revenge. Sending the initial legal letter out of pure retaliation backfired because it was fueled by a desire to hurt them. Closing the door on them weeks later succeeded because it was fueled by a desire to protect my child. When you set a boundary to manage your own peace, rather than to control someone else's behavior, you reclaim your power. You cannot dictate how a narcissist reacts to a locked door, but you have absolute control over the lock. Fourth, you cannot shield your partner from the truth to preserve a false harmony. I spent years acting as a shock absorber, hiding the toxic behavior of my in-laws to ensure Marcus could focus on his military duties. That silence allowed the dysfunction to flourish. A marriage is a partnership, and true partnerships require shared reality, even when that reality is ugly and painful. Protecting someone from the truth ultimately leaves you fighting a war alone. Finally, the title of family is an action, not an automatic birthright. Sharing a genetic lineage or a legal surname does not grant someone infinite permission to cause you harm. The people who truly deserve a place at your table are the ones who show up when the stadium music stops playing. Family members are the people who respect your home, protect your children, and stand beside you when the foundation shakes. It took a ruptured organ, a stolen emergency fund, and a terrifying state investigation for me to learn these lessons, but the knowledge is permanently etched into my worldview. My home is quiet now. The shadows have retreated. My daughter is safe. My husband is home, and our doors are securely locked against the storm. If this story resonated with you, if you have ever had to build a strong door to protect your own peace, please subscribe to Eva Tells Stories. Your support helps bring these crucial experiences to light. Share your own lessons in the comments below, and remember that you always have the right to protect your sanctuary. Stay strong, and I will see you in the next story.